On a forgotten stretch of Montana highway, a white horse lay dying in the dust, abandoned like trash on the roadside. His ribs pressed sharp against skin turned gray with neglect, breath shallow and rattling. Drivers passed without slowing, their eyes sliding away from suffering they didn't want to see. But when Tom Bennett's rusted Chevy crested the hill that Thursday evening, something made him break. That single moment of stillness would become the beginning of a journey neither man nor beast expected. A story of two broken souls finding redemption in each other when the world had written them both off as finished. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun hung low over the Montana grasslands, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. Highway 312 cut through the valley like a scar, its asphalt shimmering with heat waves that made the distant mountains waver like a mirage. On both sides, the land stretched wide and empty, dotted with sagebrush and the occasional cluster of ponderosa pines that marked where water might gather after the rains. The air smelled of dust and wild grass, that particular scent of high summer when everything has been baked dry by weeks of relentless sun. Along this lonely road, where 18-wheelers sometimes barreled past hauling timber or livestock, and where locals knew every curve and pothole by heart, something lay crumpled in the ravine beside the shoulder. From a distance, it looked like a pile of old canvas someone had dumped, or maybe the carcass of a deer that had wandered too close to traffic. The shape was pale against the red dirt, motionless except when the wind stirred dust around it. But it wasn't canvas, and it wasn't a deer. It was a horse, and he had been there for days. His coat, once white as fresh snow, had turned the color of old parchment, yellowed and streaked with dirt. Where the sun beat down directly, the skin beneath showed through in patches, raw and burned. His mane hung in matted clumps, tangled with burrs and dried grass. The eyes, once bright and alert, were clouded now, one nearly white with blindness, the other half closed against the glare. Every rib stood out in stark relief, the spine a ridge of knobs beneath the filthy hide. His legs, which should have been sturdy and strong, lay splayed at awkward angles, the joints swollen to twice their normal size. When a gust of wind swept down from the mountains, the horse's nostrils flared slightly, drawing in air that seemed too thin to sustain life. His ears, gray around the edges and torn from old injuries, twitched once toward the sound of an approaching vehicle. But he didn't lift his head. There was no strength left for that. A minivan passed, music thumping from its windows, children's faces pressed to the glass. One small hand pointed, but the driver accelerated, eyes fixed forward. Later, a cattle truck rumbled by, its driver chewing tobacco and squinting against the setting sun, never even glancing at the ravine. A motorcyclist leaned into the curve, engine roaring, gone before the dust settled. The world kept moving, and the white horse kept dying, and nobody saw any reason to connect those two facts. Flies had found him. They clustered around his eyes and the raw places where hide had worn away. He lacked even the energy to shake them off. His breathing came in shallow gasps, each one seeming like it might be the last. The sun continued its descent, and shadows began to creep across the valley floor, reaching toward him like dark fingers. Then came the sound of another engine, older and rougher than the others. A pickup truck appeared on the eastern horizon, moving slower than the rest, as if the driver had nowhere urgent to be. The vehicle was the color of dried blood, paint faded and patched with rust. One headlight was cracked, giving it a lopsided appearance. The bed was empty except for a coil of rope and a few tools that rattled with every bump in the road. Tom Bennett sat behind the wheel, his calloused hands resting lightly on the cracked leather. He was 47 but looked older, his face carved with lines that spoke of weather and work and sleepless nights. His hair, more gray than brown now, stuck out from beneath a battered Stetson that had seen better decades. His flannel shirt was faded, sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms tan dark and marked with old scars. His eyes, a pale blue that might once have been striking, had gone dull with the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. He wasn't heading anywhere in particular. The ranch behind him was quiet, too quiet, had been for 3 years now. The chores were done, what few remained. The cattle had been sold off months ago when he couldn't afford feed. The fields lay fallow, wild grass reclaiming what he'd once planted with hope. Most days, Tom drove these roads simply because staying still felt worse, because the empty house echoed with memories that cut deeper than any physical pain. Emma used to love this drive. She'd sit in the passenger seat with her boots up on the dashboard, humming along to whatever played on the radio, pointing out hawks circling overhead or wildflowers blooming in unexpected places. She'd made him see beauty in land he'd taken for granted. After the accident, after they'd pulled her car from the ravine 12 miles north, after the funeral where half the town showed up with covered dishes and awkward condolences, Tom had stopped seeing much of anything at all. He glanced at the speedometer. 35 in a 55 zone. Part of him knew he should speed up, should get home before dark, should stop wasting gas on these pointless drives. But another part, the part that had kept him breathing when breathing felt like too much effort, needed the motion, needed the illusion of going somewhere even when there was nowhere left to go. The sun touched the mountain peaks, setting them ablaze with orange and gold. Tom squinted against the glare, and that's when he saw the shape in the ravine. His foot eased off the gas pedal without conscious thought. The truck slowed, tires crunching on gravel as he drifted toward the shoulder. Probably nothing, he told himself. Probably just trash. People dumped all kinds of things out here, mattresses and busted furniture and bags of garbage they were too cheap to haul to the landfill. But something made him brake completely, made him shift into park, made him kill the engine even though every practical instinct said to keep moving. In the sudden silence, he could hear the wind whistling through the cab's weather stripping and the distant call of a magpie. He sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel, staring at the pale shape below. Then he saw it move just barely, a tremor that could have been wind or could have been breath. Tom pushed open the door and stepped out. His boots hit the pavement with a solid thud, and he stood there, one hand on the truck's hood, looking down into the ravine. The slope wasn't steep, maybe 15 feet from road to bottom, the dirt loose and scattered with rocks. The shape lay at the lowest point where water would flow during spring runoff, though now the ground was baked hard as concrete. He took 3 steps down the slope before he was certain. It was a horse. The realization hit him with unexpected force, stealing his breath. He'd grown up around horses, had worked with them his whole life, had raised quarter horses with Emma before everything fell apart. He knew their lines and movements, could read their moods and needs. And he knew, looking at this one, that it was beyond suffering into a place where death might actually be a mercy. But Tom kept walking. His boots slid on the loose dirt, small avalanches of pebbles cascading ahead of him. The smell reached him halfway down, the sour stench of neglect and infected wounds and slow starvation. His stomach turned, but he didn't stop. When he reached the bottom, he stood there for a moment just looking. The horse lay on its side, legs extended as if running in a dream. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It would never wake from. Up close, Tom could see every horrible detail. The white coat wasn't just dirty. It was matted with dried blood and pus from sores that had gone untreated for so long they'd festered. The hooves were cracked and overgrown, split in places, one shoe hanging by a single bent nail. Across the hindquarters, faint but unmistakable, were the marks of a whip, old scars that had healed badly, crisscrossing the hide in a pattern that spoke of sustained cruelty. Tom crouched, his knees protesting, and reached out slowly. His hand hovered over the horse's neck, hesitating. Some part of him didn't want to touch this, didn't want to make it real, didn't want to take on one more ounce of responsibility for suffering he couldn't fix. He'd failed enough already. Failed Emma, failed their unborn child, failed the ranch, failed himself. What made him think he could do anything for this dying animal? But his hand lowered anyway, fingers brushing the coarse hide. The horse flinched, a full-body tremor that shook its frame. Then, slowly, its head lifted maybe 2 inches off the ground. The one good eye, clouded but not quite blind, found Tom's face. They looked at each other across a gulf of pain that needed no translation. Tom had seen a lot of eyes in his life. He'd seen fear in the eyes of Greenbroke colts, trust in the eyes of horses he'd raised from foals, exhaustion in the eyes of cattle driven too hard to market. But this was different. This eye held something that made his throat close up, something that looked uncomfortably like recognition. Not of him specifically, but of what he represented, one last chance that probably wouldn't come. His hand moved of its own accord, stroking along the neck in slow, careful movements. The hide was hot to the touch, fever burning beneath. He could feel the rapid flutter of the pulse, too fast, too weak. Under his palm, the horse's breathing remained shallow and labored, each exhale a soft wheeze that rattled in the chest. Tom glanced back at his truck, sitting alone on the empty highway. The sun was nearly gone now, just a rim of fire on the horizon. In maybe 20 minutes it would be full dark. He thought about climbing back up that slope, getting in his truck, driving away. The horse was old, probably 20 years or more if he was reading the signs right. It had been used hard and discarded, left to die in a ditch like garbage. The kindest thing might be to call the sheriff, ask him to send someone out with a rifle to end it quick. That's what most people would do. That's what made sense. But Tom kept his hand on the horse's neck, kept feeling that desperate pulse, kept looking into that clouded eye. And he thought about the night Emma died, about standing in the hospital corridor while doctors spoke words he couldn't process, about the moment he'd understood she was gone, and he was still here, still breathing when breathing felt like betrayal. He remembered the weight of other people's pity, the way they'd looked at him like he was something broken beyond repair, something not worth the effort of fixing. Nobody had given up on him, not completely. Rita Lawson had kept bringing food even when he wouldn't answer the door. Dr. Morrison had stopped by the ranch once a week under the pretense of checking on livestock that didn't exist anymore, just to make sure Tom was still alive. The town hadn't forgotten him, even when he'd tried to disappear. The horse's head dropped back to the dirt, the brief effort too much. But the eye stayed on Tom, waiting. He made his decision without quite realizing it, stood up, and started climbing back toward the truck. His legs felt heavy, his chest tight. When he reached the bed, he grabbed the rope and an old saddle blanket he kept for emergencies. Then he paused, resting his hands on the tailgate, looking back down at the dying horse. This was foolish. This was impractical. This would cost money he didn't have, time he couldn't spare, and emotional energy he'd run dry of 3 years ago. Every rational part of his mind screamed at him to walk away. But Tom had learned that rationality didn't mean much when you were drowning in silence, when every day blurred into the next in an endless gray parade of just getting through. Maybe you reached a point where foolish was all you had left. He returned to the ravine with the rope and blanket. The horse didn't react to his approach this time, too far gone to care. Tom knelt and spread the blanket carefully, then began the impossible task of figuring out how to move 1,000 pounds of dying animal 15 feet uphill to his truck. He was strong from years of ranch work, but this would push him to the limit and beyond. The sky had deepened to purple, stars beginning to prick through. A coyote yipped somewhere in the distance, and Tom worked faster. He fashioned a makeshift harness from the rope, trying to distribute pressure away from the worst of the wounds and sores. His hands, rough as they were, moved with surprising gentleness, each knot tied with care. The horse lay passive, lacking the strength to resist or help. When everything was ready, Tom positioned himself and began to pull. The horse didn't budge. He adjusted his stance, planted his boots, and pulled harder. Nothing. Sweat broke out on his forehead despite the cooling air. He tried again, muscles burning, back screaming in protest. The horse slid maybe 6 inches, loose dirt cascading around them. Tom stopped, breathing hard, and looked at the animal. This wasn't going to work. The horse was too heavy, the slope too steep, his strength too limited. He'd need help, need equipment, need things he didn't have. But the nearest ranch was 8 miles away, and by the time he drove there and back with assistance, the horse would almost certainly be dead. He sat down in the dirt beside the animal, exhausted and frustrated and angry at himself for even trying. The stars were Brilliant now, the Milky Way a river of light overhead. Emma had loved the stars. She'd known all the constellations, could point out planets and tell you their names. Tom knew none of it, had never bothered to learn. He'd always figured there would be time. The horse's breathing changed, becoming even more labored. Tom put his hand back on its neck, feeling the life ebbing away under his palm. And something inside him, something that had been frozen for 3 years, cracked. Not broke, not yet, but cracked enough that feeling started seeping through. He leaned closer and began to speak, his voice rough from disuse. The words came halting at first, then easier, spilling out into the Montana night like water from a breached dam. He told the horse about Emma, about the accident, about the baby they'd never gotten to meet. He talked about the ranch that used to mean something, about quarter horses they'd raised with pride, about mornings when life had felt full instead of empty. He confessed his failures, his grief, his 3 years of just existing without living. And as he talked, something shifted. Maybe it was the stars, or the cooling air, or the simple act of speaking truth aloud. But Tom felt his resolve harden into something like determination. This horse wasn't going to die alone in a ditch, not tonight, not if he had anything to say about it. He stood up, wiped his face, and surveyed the situation with fresh eyes. He couldn't pull the horse up the slope. But maybe, if he was clever and stubborn enough, he could make a path the horse could walk. If it could walk at all. Tom climbed back to the truck and retrieved a shovel from the toolbox, along with a flashlight. For the next hour, he worked in the beam of that light, digging and scraping and leveling a gradual ramp from the bottom of the ravine to the road. His shoulders burned, his hands blistered, his back felt like it might give out. But he kept digging, kept clearing rocks, kept shaping the earth into something passable. When it was done, when he'd created the gentlest slope he could manage, Tom returned to the horse. He knelt and spoke softly, explaining what needed to happen, as if the animal could understand. Then, with infinite care, he began working the rope, using it not to pull but to support, to give the horse something to lean against as it tried to rise. First, nothing happened. The horse lay motionless, perhaps too far gone, perhaps simply done trying. Tom kept coaxing, kept his hands steady on the neck, kept his voice low and calm. And then, impossibly, the horse's front legs shifted. One hoof found purchase. Then another. The animal's head came up, swaying dangerously, and Tom was there, supporting the weight, his shoulder under the jaw, his arms around the neck. Together, inch by terrible inch, they got the horse to its feet. It stood trembling, legs splayed wide, head hanging almost to the ground. But it was standing. Tom didn't give it time to collapse. With the rope as a guide and his body as a brace, he began coaxing the horse toward the ramp he'd built. The walk up that slope took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of stopping every few feet, of letting the horse catch its breath, of Tom supporting hundreds of pounds of weight he shouldn't have been able to hold. Twice the horse nearly went down, and twice Tom caught it, held it, urged it forward with words that were half prayer, half command. When they reached the road, Tom had to stop and rest. His entire body shook with exhaustion. The horse stood beside him, sides heaving, head low, but still upright. Tom looked at his truck and knew the next challenge might be impossible. Getting the horse into the bed would require strength he'd already spent. But the truck had a loading ramp, old and warped but still functional, that he'd used years ago when transporting livestock. He pulled it out, positioned it carefully, and hoped. The horse looked at the ramp, then at Tom, and in that clouded eye, he saw something he hadn't expected. The horse was trying. Against all reason, against all odds, this dying animal was still fighting. With encouragement and support, the horse placed one hoof on the ramp. Then another. The incline was gentle, but each step looked like agony. Tom walked beside him, one hand on the rope, the other on the horse's shoulder, murmuring constant reassurance. When they reached the bed of the truck, when the horse finally stood on that flat surface and Tom could slide the gate closed behind him, he had to sit down right there in the road, his legs giving out. He sat with his back against the truck tire, looking up at the stars, feeling tears run down his face that he didn't bother to wipe away. The horse stood above him in the truck bed, swaying but alive, having done what should have been impossible. Tom didn't know if the horse would survive the night, didn't know if his effort would amount to anything more than prolonging suffering. But sitting there on that empty highway under a sky full of stars, with a dying horse standing in his truck against all odds, he felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. He felt like maybe, just maybe, broken things could still have value. Maybe giving up wasn't the only option. Maybe there was still room in this world for mercy, even the foolish kind that defied logic. He climbed to his feet, joints protesting, and got behind the wheel, started the engine, put the truck in gear, and began the slow drive home to a ranch that hadn't felt like home in a long time, carrying a burden he'd chosen when he could have driven past, when anyone else would have driven past. The headlights cut through the darkness, and Tom drove carefully, avoiding potholes, taking curves slow. In the bed behind him, the white horse stood motionless, head hanging low, clinging to life with a stubbornness that matched Tom's own. Neither of them knew what morning would bring. But for now, for tonight, they were both still here. And sometimes that's all redemption requires to begin. The drive back to the ranch felt longer than the 7 miles it actually covered. Tom kept his speed under 20, wincing at every bump and pothole that jarred the truck bed. Through the rear window, he could see the white horse swaying with the motion, legs locked in place more from rigidity than strength. The animal hadn't lain down, which Tom took as either a good sign or proof that it was too scared to let its guard down. Either way, keeping it upright seemed important. The headlights swept across familiar landmarks that had stopped meaning much to him years ago. The twisted oak that marked the turnoff to the Henderson place, now abandoned after Old Man Henderson died and his kids sold out to a development company that never developed anything. The mailbox cluster where 5 ranch families used to collect their letters, now down to 2 functioning boxes, the others rusted open or missing entirely. The bridge over Crooked Creek, which ran dry 9 months out of the year and was living up to its name even now, the culvert beneath showing nothing but cracked mud and scattered stones. When the ranch finally came into view, Tom felt the usual hollow sensation in his chest, the one that came from seeing a place that used to bustle with purpose now sitting quiet as a graveyard. The house was a simple 2-story structure, white paint gone gray, front porch sagging slightly on one side where the supports needed replacing. Emma had wanted to repaint it yellow, had picked out the color and everything, but they'd never gotten around to it. Now the cans sat in the shed, probably dried solid. The barn stood beyond the house, older than the property itself if the dates carved into the foundation beam were accurate. It was built in the traditional style, tall enough to store hay in the loft, wide enough to house a dozen horses comfortably. Red paint still clung to most of the boards, though weather had stripped whole sections down to gray wood. The roof was tin, patched in places where hail had punched through, and it sang in the wind with a sound Tom had learned to sleep through. He pulled the truck around to the barn's main entrance, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. The interior light didn't work anymore, so darkness pressed against the windows. Through the windshield, he could see the barn door hanging slightly crooked on its track, the way it had been for 2 years since a storm had bent the runner. One more thing he'd meant to fix and hadn't. Tom climbed out, his body immediately reporting every strain and pull from the last 2 hours. His lower back sent up sharp protests when he straightened. His shoulders felt like someone had driven nails through the joints. The blisters on his palms from the shovel work were already weeping, the fluid making his grip slick. He ignored all of it and moved to the back of the truck. The horse stood exactly as before, head low, eyes half closed. In the ambient light from the stars and the thin crescent moon, its white coat looked spectral, like something not quite attached to the physical world. Tom lowered the gate carefully, the hinges screaming from lack of oil. The sound made the horse's ears twitch but nothing more. Getting the animal down proved easier than loading it had been, mostly because gravity did half the work. Tom positioned the ramp, guided the horse to the edge, and let it walk down at its own pace. Each step looked painful, the hooves landing with careful deliberation, but the horse made it to solid ground without collapsing. Small victories, Tom thought. He'd take what he could get. The barn door required 2 hands and significant effort to shove open. The wheels shrieked along the bent track, and Tom made a mental note to add it to the list of repairs that kept growing longer while his motivation to complete them kept shrinking. Inside, the barn smelled of old hay and dust and the particular mustiness of a space that had been closed up too long. He felt along the wall for the light switch, found it, and flipped it up. Nothing happened. He tried it twice more with the same result before remembering that he'd shut off power to the barn last winter to save on the electric bill. He'd been heating only the house, and even that minimally, and the barn had no reason to draw current when it stood empty. Now he regretted the decision, but there wasn't time to go flip the breaker. He'd have to make do with the camping lanterns he kept in the tack room. Tom retrieved 2 battery-powered lanterns and set them on overturned buckets, their LED glow casting harsh shadows across the interior. The barn had 8 stalls along one wall, feed room and tack room taking up the other. The center aisle was wide enough to drive a tractor through, which he'd done more than once when moving hay. The concrete floor was cracked in places, weeds pushing through, but mostly intact. Above, the loft stretched across the entire space, accessible by a ladder that looked less trustworthy every year. He led the horse to the nearest stall, the one closest to the feed room. The door hung open, the interior empty except for old straw compressed into the corners, and a water bucket coated in dust and spider webs. It would have to do for now. Tom guided the horse inside, and the animal immediately moved to the back corner, turned with agonizing slowness, and stood facing outward, as if needing to see any threat that might come through the door. Tom studied the horse in better light and felt his stomach drop. He'd known it was bad, but the full extent was worse than he'd imagined. Besides the obvious starvation and the scarring, the horse had injuries he hadn't noticed in the ravine. The left hind leg had a swelling above the hock that suggested an old injury, probably a bowed tendon that had healed badly. The right front hoof was cracked nearly to the coronary band, a split that must have been excruciating to walk on. Both eyes were clouded, the left almost completely white with what looked like an advanced cataract. The teeth, when Tom carefully lifted the lip to check, were worn down to nubs, filed nearly flat by age and probably years of eating sandy, poor-quality feed. This wasn't just a horse that had been abandoned. This was a horse that had been used up, worked until there was nothing left to give, then discarded when it finally broke down. The realization made Tom's jaw tighten. He'd seen it before, knew it happened more often than people wanted to admit, but seeing it up close made his hands ball into fists. He forced himself to breathe, to focus on what could be done rather than what had been done. The horse needed water first, then food if it could eat, then medical attention he wasn't qualified to provide. Tom grabbed the dusty bucket from the stall, carried it to the spigot outside, and rinsed it 3 times before filling it with clean water. When he brought it back and set it in the corner, the horse looked at it but didn't move. Tom dipped his fingers in the water and held them near the horse's muzzle. The nostrils flared, scenting moisture, and then the lips parted slightly. A tongue, dry as old leather, reached out to lick the water from his fingers. Tom repeated the gesture, letting the horse take its time, not forcing anything. After several licks, the horse finally lowered its head to the bucket and drank in small, careful sips. Watching the animal drink, Tom felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. Such a small thing, water. He'd turned on faucets 1,000 times without thinking about it, had let water run while he brushed his teeth or washed dishes, had never once considered it a luxury. But to this horse, this bucket represented life itself, represented someone caring enough to provide the most basic need. When the horse had drunk maybe a quarter of the bucket, it stopped and raised its head, water dripping from its muzzle. Tom wanted to encourage it to drink more but knew better than to push. Too much water too fast could cause colic, and the horse's system was already struggling. Better to let it drink small amounts frequently than risk overloading it. Next came food, which presented a problem. Tom hadn't kept horse feed on the property in over a year. He had some cattle pellets left in the feed room, supplements he'd never gotten around to throwing out after selling the last of the herd, but those were formulated wrong for a horse and might do more harm than good. He needed hay, preferably alfalfa for the protein and calories, But his hay barn was empty except for some rotted bales in the back corner that even cattle wouldn't touch. He stood in the feed room, lantern in hand, trying to figure out what he could offer that wouldn't make things worse. His eyes landed on a shelf near the back where Emma had kept garden supplies and random odds and ends. Among the dusty containers, he spotted an old tin of oats, the kind she'd used to feed the chickens before they'd gotten rid of those too. He pulled it down, popped the lid, and found the oats still good, or at least not visibly moldy. Tom poured a small amount into a rubber feed pan, added some water to soften them, and carried the mixture to the stall. The horse watched his approach with that clouded eye, head still low, body radiating exhaustion. Tom set the pan on the ground and stepped back, giving the animal space. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the horse took one careful step forward, lowered its head, and sniffed the oats. The first bite was tentative, barely anything, just lips pulling at the wet grain. Then another bite slightly larger. The horse chewed slowly, mechanically, and Tom noticed it favoring one side of its mouth, probably because of bad teeth or an abscess. But it ate small amounts at a time until half the pan was empty. Then it stopped, lifted its head, and simply stood there, swaying slightly. Tom removed the pan and backed out of the stall, pulling the door closed but not latching it. The horse needed to feel it could escape if threatened, needed to know it wasn't trapped. He set up the lanterns so they'd provide ambient light without shining directly into the stall, then dragged over a hay bale to sit on. His body screamed for rest, for a hot shower and a bed, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Not yet. Not while the horse stood there looking like it might collapse at any moment. He sat on the hay bale, elbows on his knees, and watched the white shape in the stall. The horse's breathing had evened out slightly, the desperate rasping quality fading to something more regular, though still labored. Its eyes were half closed, head drooping lower, but the legs remained locked, holding position. Tom recognized the stance, had seen it in injured horses before. The animal was too afraid to lie down, too conditioned to expect pain or threat if it showed vulnerability. The night deepened around them. Outside, an owl called from the cottonwood grove, the sound echoing across the empty fields. Tom heard mice rustling in the loft above, probably getting into whatever old feed bags he'd left up there. A coyote yipped from somewhere near the creek bed, soon joined by others, their chorus rising and falling. Normal ranch sounds, the soundtrack of rural Montana nights, sounds that had surrounded him for 47 years, but which he'd stopped really hearing sometime after Emma died. Tom must have dozed off, because he jerked awake to the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. His heart hammering, he grabbed the lantern and rushed to the stall. The horse had finally gone down, lying on its side in the straw, flanks heaving. For a terrible moment, Tom thought it was dying, that all his effort had been for nothing. Then the horse's eye opened, found him, and blinked slowly. Not dying, just exhausted beyond the ability to stand any longer. Tom opened the stall door and crouched just inside, not approaching, just being present. The horse made no move to rise, simply lay there breathing, its body finally able to rest. Tom watched the rise and fall of the ribcage, counting breaths without meaning to, finding himself hoping for each next one. At some point, his hand moved to his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, an old model with a cracked screen that he kept charged more from habit than need. He scrolled through the contacts, most of them outdated or belonging to people he hadn't spoken to in years. He stopped on Dr. Morrison's number, his thumb hovering over the call button. It was past midnight, way too late to call anyone, but this couldn't wait until morning. The horse needed medical attention, needed someone who actually knew what they were doing, needed expertise Tom didn't possess. He pressed call and listened to the ring, half hoping it would go to voicemail so he wouldn't have to explain himself. But on the fourth ring, a voice answered, rough with sleep but alert. Frank Morrison had been a veterinarian for 38 years, had treated everything from prize bulls to children's hamsters, and had a reputation for being more concerned with animal welfare than profit margins. He was in his mid-60s now, silver beard and wire-rimmed glasses that he was forever losing. He'd known Tom since Tom was a kid tagging along with his father to cattle auctions, had treated the Bennett family's animals for 3 generations, and had been one of the people who'd made sure Tom didn't completely fall apart after Emma died. Tom explained the situation in halting sentences, describing what he'd found, what he'd done, what he was seeing now. He expected skepticism, maybe even criticism for taking on something this far gone. Instead, Frank was quiet for a moment, then said he'd be there in 40 minutes. He hung up before Tom could thank him. Tom returned to his spot on the hay bale, phone still in his hand, and looked at the home screen. The background image was one he'd never changed, a photo of Emma standing in front of the barn on a summer day, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and one of his old work shirts, smiling at the camera with her whole face. She'd been 7 months pregnant in that photo, though you could barely tell. They'd lost her and the baby 2 weeks later, when a drunk driver crossed the center line on Highway 87. Tom stared at the image, at Emma's smile, and felt the familiar weight settle over him. She would have stopped for the horse without hesitation. Would have already named it something, probably something simultaneously sentimental and ridiculous. Would have chided him for even thinking about driving past. Emma had possessed an immediate compassion that Tom had always admired but never quite shared. He was practical, sometimes to a fault, the kind of person who weighed costs and benefits before acting. She'd been the one who acted first and figured out the details later. But tonight he'd stopped. He'd chosen compassion over practicality. And sitting here in the dark barn, watching a dying horse cling to life, Tom wondered if maybe some part of Emma lived on in choices like that. If maybe the best way to honor her wasn't to lock himself away in grief, but to do the things she would have done. The headlights of Frank Morrison's truck cut through the barn door opening at 1:37 in the morning. Tom had been tracking the time on his phone, watching the minutes crawl past, listening to the horse breathe. When he heard the diesel engine shut off and the truck door slam, relief flooded through him. He wasn't alone in this anymore. Frank walked into the barn carrying a battered leather medical bag that looked older than Tom. The veterinarian was shorter than Tom remembered, or maybe Tom had just grown used to his own hunched posture and everyone seemed diminished. Frank's beard was more white than gray now. His face lined deeply around the eyes and mouth, but his movements were steady and sure. He nodded once at Tom, then moved directly to the stall without preamble. Tom stood back as Frank examined the horse, his practiced hands moving over the body with efficient gentleness. He checked vitals, listened to the heart and lungs, examined the hooves and legs, looked at the teeth and eyes. His expression revealed nothing, but Tom saw the slight tightening around his mouth when he found the whip scars, the shake of his head when he assessed the cracked hoof. The examination took 20 minutes, thorough and methodical, and when Frank finally stood and turned to Tom, his face was grave. The veterinarian explained what Tom was dealing with in terms that were clinical but not cold. Severe malnutrition, obviously, with the body consuming its own muscle tissue to survive. Dehydration that had affected kidney function. The cracked hoof was infected, which explained some of the fever. The cataracts were too advanced for treatment. Multiple old injuries that had healed wrong, probably causing chronic pain. The horse was somewhere between 20 and 25 years old, ancient by working horse standards, and had been used hard for most of those years. Tom listened to the litany of problems and felt his resolve waver. This was too much, too broken, too far gone. Frank must have seen it in his face because he paused, then asked the question Tom had been avoiding. Did Tom want him to end it? He could do it right now, make it quick and painless, let the horse slip away without any more suffering. It would be the merciful choice, the practical one, and nobody would blame Tom for making it. Tom looked at the horse lying in the straw, at the way its breathing had steadied, at how it had finally felt safe enough to rest. He thought about the climb up from the ravine, about impossible steps taken on legs that shouldn't have been able to hold weight. He thought about Emma, about second chances and stubborn hope and choosing compassion even when it made no sense. He told Frank no. He wanted to try. Whatever it took, whatever it cost, he wanted to give the horse a chance. Frank studied him for a long moment, then nodded and opened his bag. If they were doing this, they were doing it right. The horse would need fluids, antibiotics, pain medication. Frank would start treatment tonight and come back in the morning to reassess. But Tom needed to understand that the odds weren't good. Even with treatment, the horse might not survive the week. There would be no guarantees, no promises, just effort and hope and whatever mercy they could provide. Tom said he understood, and he did. But understanding the odds and accepting them were different things. He helped Frank set up in four-line, holding the bag while the veterinarian worked. The horse barely reacted to the needle, either too tired to care or too far gone to feel it. Frank administered antibiotics, pain medication, and something he said would help with the fever. He wrapped the cracked hoof in a poultice, explaining that it would need to be changed daily, showed Tom how to do it. He left medication bottles with detailed instructions, made Tom repeat the dosages back to him to be sure he understood. When everything was done, when the 4-bag hung from a nail Frank had driven into the stall post, when the medications were lined up on a shelf in the feed room, Frank packed up his bag and turned to leave. At the barn door, he paused and looked back at Tom. He didn't say anything encouraging or reassuring. He simply acknowledged that what Tom was attempting was difficult, probably more difficult than Tom realized, but that the horse was lucky to have been found by someone willing to try. Then he was gone, taillights disappearing down the ranch road, leaving Tom alone again with his impossible task. Tom returned to the stall and lowered himself to sit in the straw near the horse's head. The animal's eye was closed now, breathing deeper and more regular than before. Whether that was the medication working or simply exhaustion taking over, Tom couldn't tell. He leaned back against the wall, his own exhaustion finally catching up with him. His body ached in places he'd forgotten he had. His hands were raw. His back felt like it had been beaten with a fence post. But underneath the physical pain, something else stirred, something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Purpose. Simple, uncomplicated purpose. The horse needed care, and he could provide it. The tasks were clear and concrete. Keep the animal hydrated, fed, medicated, clean. Watch for signs of improvement or decline. Adjust treatment as needed. For someone who'd been drifting through empty days with no direction, the sudden structure felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Tom must have fallen asleep there in the straw, because when he opened his eyes, pale light was seeping through the gaps in the barn walls. Dawn was breaking over the Montana plains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. He sat up, every muscle protesting, and immediately checked the horse. It was still breathing, still had a pulse in the jaw when he felt for it. The 4-bag was empty, which Frank had said meant the horse's body was absorbing the fluids. A good sign, maybe the first real good sign since this whole thing started. Tom stood carefully, his back screaming at him, and went to refresh the water bucket. When he returned, the horse's eye was open, watching him. He set the bucket down, and after a moment, the horse lifted its head slightly and drank. Just a few sips, but it was something. Tom found himself smiling, actually smiling, at such a small victory. The morning sun climbed higher, and Tom went through the motions of caring for the horse with a methodical attention to detail. He changed the poultice on the hoof, administered the medications Frank had left, replaced the water, offered more softened oats. The horse ate a little, drank a little, and mostly rested. Tom cleaned the stall, spreading fresh straw he found in the loft, doing his best to create a comfortable environment. When the basic care was finished, Tom found himself at a loss. The ranch chores that usually filled his days seemed unimportant now, irrelevant compared to the life hanging in the balance in stall number 1. He couldn't just leave the horse alone. Not yet. Not when things could turn bad so quickly. So he stayed, settling onto his hay bale perch, and simply kept watch. As the morning wore on, Tom started talking. At first, just explaining what he was doing when he entered the stall to check vitals or change water. Then, gradually, talking about other things. He told the horse about the ranch, about how it had been passed down through 3 generations of Bennetts, about the years when it had thrived and the slow decline that had started even before Emma died. He talked about Emma herself, about meeting her at a county fair when he was 23 and she was 21. About how she'd been visiting from Missoula and had stopped at his booth selling leather goods his mother made. The words came easier than they had in years, easier than they'd come with Dr. Morrison's gentle prompting or Rita Lawson's kind questions. Maybe because the horse couldn't respond, couldn't offer platitudes or try to fix things, couldn't do anything but listen. Or maybe because in caring for something so broken, Tom finally had permission to acknowledge his own brokenness without shame. He told the horse about the accident, about the phone call from the sheriff's office, about standing in the hospital morgue identifying Emma's body while knowing their child had died with her. He talked about the funeral, about people he barely knew telling him it was God's plan or that time heals all wounds or that he was young enough to start over. He talked about the rage that had burned through him, then the numbness that had settled in when the rage burned out, then the hollow emptiness that had defined the last 3 years. The horse listened, or at least seemed to. Its clouded eye fixed on Tom whenever he spoke. And Tom found himself confessing things he'd never said aloud, admitting that he'd thought about selling the ranch, about leaving Montana entirely, about simply walking away from everything because what was the point of holding on to land that held nothing but ghosts? He admitted that some mornings, he'd looked at Emma's pain medication that he'd kept in the medicine cabinet and wondered if taking all of it would be easier than facing another empty day. Saying it out loud, hearing the words in his own voice, made Tom realize how close he'd come to giving up entirely. How many mornings he'd driven past that ravine without seeing the horse until yesterday. How easily he could have kept driving yesterday too, could have been just another person who chose not to see suffering because seeing it meant having to do something about it. But he had seen it. He had stopped. And now here he was, sitting in a barn at 9 in the morning, talking to a dying horse about suicide and grief and the terrible weight of continuing to exist when the person who made existence meaningful was gone. It should have felt ridiculous. Instead, it felt like the first honest conversation he'd had in 3 years. The horse shifted in the straw, the movement small but deliberate. It raised its head a few inches, enough to look directly at Tom, and exhaled softly through its nostrils. Not a whinny, not a sound really, just a breath. But Tom felt it like a response, like acknowledgement, like the horse was saying it understood because it had survived its own kind of hell and was still here despite everything. Tom stood up and walked to the stall, crouched down next to the horse's head, and rested his hand on the scarred neck. The hide was warmer now, the fever breaking maybe, or maybe that was just wishful thinking. Under his palm, he felt the steady pulse, the rhythm of life persisting against long odds. He stayed there for several minutes, just touching the horse, feeling that connection between two beings who'd both been left for dead by a world that had moved on without them. When he finally stood and left the stall, Tom felt something shift inside his chest, some weight redistributing itself into a shape he could carry more easily. The grief was still there, would probably always be there, but it wasn't quite so crushing anymore. He had a reason to get up tomorrow. He had something that needed him. He had a purpose beyond simply existing. He walked out of the barn into the morning sunlight, squinting against the brightness, and looked across his land with eyes that actually saw it for the first time in years. The fields were overgrown, the fences sagging, the equipment rusting where it sat, but underneath all the neglect, the bones of something good remained. This ranch had meant something once. Maybe it could again. Tom heard a vehicle approaching and turned to see Rita Lawson's ancient station wagon bouncing up the drive, dust rising behind it. She parked near the house, climbed out with a covered dish in her hands, and walked toward him with the determined stride of someone who wouldn't take no for an answer. Rita was 62, had lost her husband to cancer 8 years back, and had dealt with her grief by baking for the entire county. Tom had been on the receiving end of her pies and casseroles for 3 years, mostly leaving them on the porch where she left them until they spoiled. But today he walked to meet her halfway, and when she held out the dish, he took it. Rita's eyes widened slightly at this break in routine, then narrowed as she studied his face. She asked if he was all right, and Tom surprised himself by saying yes. Not perfect, not fixed, but all right. He told her about the horse, about the rescue, about Dr. Morrison's visit. Rita listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she smiled and said she'd like to see it. Tom led her to the barn, and they stood outside the stall looking at the white horse lying in the straw. Rita didn't say it was foolish or a waste of time. She asked what the horse needed, and when Tom mentioned hay and proper feed, she said her nephew ran a feed store in town and would give Tom a fair price. She asked if he needed help with the care, and Tom said not yet but maybe soon. She nodded, handed him the casserole, which turned out to be chicken and rice, and told him to call if he needed anything at all. After she left, Tom ate the casserole sitting on the front porch steps, the first real meal he'd had in longer than he could remember. It tasted good, better than anything he'd made for himself, and he realized how long it had been since he'd eaten something someone else had cooked with care. The simple act of accepting help, of letting someone else carry a small part of the load, felt significant in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He spent the afternoon making the barn more comfortable, doing all the small repairs he'd been putting off. He fixed the crooked door, oiled the hinges, swept out the accumulated dust and cobwebs. He found old blankets in the house and brought them down for the horse, draping them carefully over the thin body to help with warmth. He mucked out the stall properly, spread fresh bedding thick and even, refilled the water bucket for the fourth time. Frank Morrison returned at dusk as promised, checking vitals and nodding approvingly at the slight improvements. The horse's temperature had dropped 2 degrees, the breathing was less labored, and it had eaten more of the oats Tom offered. Small victories, Frank said, but victories nonetheless. He administered another round of medications, changed the forebag, and showed Tom how to check for signs of colic or respiratory distress. Before leaving, he mentioned that Tom should think about a name. Naming something meant claiming it, meant committing to see it through, and if Tom was going to do this, he should do it properly. After Frank left, Tom sat on his hay bale and thought about names. He'd never been good at naming things, had always left that to Emma. She'd named all their horses with a combination of whimsy and affection that somehow always fit perfectly. But Emma wasn't here, and this was Tom's responsibility now. He looked at the white horse lying in the clean straw, illuminated by the soft glow of the lanterns. In the dim light, the animal looked almost translucent, like something caught between this world and the next, not quite solid, not quite real. A ghost of what it had been, haunting the space between death and life. The word came to him fully formed, feeling right in a way he couldn't explain. Tom stood and walked to the stall, crouched down near the horse's head, and spoke clearly. He said the name out loud, testing it, hearing how it sounded in the quiet barn. Ghost. The horse's ear flicked toward him, and the clouded eye opened, fixing on his face. Tom said it again, and this time the horse exhaled softly, as if accepting the identity. Ghost. A name for something that shouldn't exist but did anyway. Something that had passed through death's shadow and somehow emerged on the other side still breathing. Fit the horse, and maybe Tom thought it fit him too. They were both ghosts in their own way, both haunting the spaces where they'd once been whole, both clinging to existence when giving up would have been easier. Tom settled back on his hay bale and looked at Ghost lying in the stall, properly named now, claimed and acknowledged and his to care for. The night deepened around them, stars appearing one by one in the Montana sky, and for the first time in 3 years, Tom Bennett felt like he might survive the darkness. Not because the grief was gone or because anything was fixed, but because he'd found someone who needed him to survive too. And sometimes that's all it takes to tip the balance from giving up to holding on. Sometimes you need to save something else before you can save yourself. Tom didn't have the words to express that truth, but sitting in the barn with Ghost breathing steadily in the stall behind him, he felt it in his bones with absolute certainty. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new worries, new reasons to doubt this decision. But tonight, in this moment, Tom had done something right. He'd chosen compassion over convenience, had chosen to act instead of turning away, had chosen to try even when success seemed impossible. And Ghost, lying in clean straw with food and water and someone watching over him, had chosen to keep breathing for one more night. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The first full day of caring for Ghost brought Tom face to face with realities he'd underestimated. The horse was worse in daylight. The morning sun exposing details the lantern glow had softened. The white coat was more gray than white, streaked with yellow where urine had soaked into the hide during the days spent lying in that ravine. The ribs weren't just visible. They cast shadows across the gaunt barrel, each one a finger pointing at neglect. The hip bones jutted so sharply they looked ready to pierce through skin, and the hollows above the eyes gave Ghost's face a skull-like quality that made Tom's stomach turn. But Ghost was alive. When Tom entered the barn at dawn, having spent a fitful night in his own bed dreaming of white horses falling into endless chasms. He found Ghost awake and watching the barn door with that clouded eye. The horse's head lifted slightly when Tom approached, recognition flickering across features worn down by suffering. It wasn't much, but it was connection, and Tom grabbed onto it like a rope thrown to someone drowning. He started with water, always water first, because Frank had stressed hydration above almost everything else. Ghost drank more readily this morning, taking longer pulls from the bucket instead of the tentative sips of yesterday. Tom measured the consumption, noting that Ghost had taken down almost 3 gallons overnight, and felt a small spark of satisfaction. The body was accepting help, responding to care, and every swallow felt like a victory against the odds. Feeding proved more complicated. The softened oats had worked well enough for emergency measures, but Ghost needed real nutrition, needed the kind of feed formulated specifically for equine systems, especially for senior horses with compromised digestion. Tom made a mental list of what he'd need from Rita's nephew at the feed store, but that would have to wait until the place opened at 8. For now, he offered more oats mixed with some molasses he found in the back of his pantry, creating a mash that might be easier on Ghost's worn-down teeth and damaged digestive tract. Ghost ate slowly, chewing with a careful deliberation that spoke to pain Tom couldn't see. The horse would take a mouthful, chew for what seemed like minutes, swallow with visible effort, then rest before attempting another bite. It took 20 minutes to consume what a healthy horse would have finished in 2. But Tom didn't rush him. He sat outside the stall with a notepad Frank had suggested he keep, documenting everything. Amount eaten, time taken, manner of chewing, any signs of discomfort. Building a record that might help track improvement or catch problems before they became crises. When Ghost had eaten about a pound of the mash and stopped, clearly done despite half the pan remaining, Tom removed it and began the next task on his list. Grooming. He'd found an old curry comb and soft brush in the tack room, tools that hadn't been used since Emma died, and though touching them brought a familiar ache, he carried them to Ghost's stall with steady hands. The horse tensed when Tom entered the stall properly for the first time, not just reaching in from the doorway but actually sharing the space. Ghost's ears flattened, nostrils flaring, and for a moment Tom thought the animal might try to rise, might panic. But he stood still, spoke in low tones about nothing in particular, and waited. Ghost's ears gradually came forward again, the tension easing from muscles that couldn't afford to waste energy on fear. Tom started at the shoulder, the curry comb moving in slow circles, loosening dirt that had been ground into the hide. Dust rose in clouds, catching in the morning light that slanted through the barn's gaps. He worked with infinite patience, keeping his movements predictable and gentle, speaking constantly in that low voice that seemed to calm both of them. The curry comb revealed skin beneath, pink and healthy-looking in some places, scarred and damaged in others. The whip marks were impossible to ignore up close. They crisscrossed Ghost's hindquarters and back in a pattern that told a story Tom didn't want to read. These weren't the marks of occasional discipline. These were the marks of sustained cruelty, of someone who'd used pain as a primary training tool, who'd beaten this horse into submission over and over until Ghost had learned that resistance brought suffering and compliance brought nothing but more work. Tom's jaw clenched as he brushed over those scars, fury building in his chest at whoever had done this. But the anger wasn't useful, wasn't productive, so he channeled it into the work. He brushed every inch of Ghost he could reach without forcing the horse to move, working around the legs that remained folded beneath the body, careful of the infected hoof and the swollen tendon. The white coat began to emerge from beneath the grime, not pristine but cleaner, and Ghost's breathing slowed, eyes half closing in something that might have been relaxation. An hour passed before Tom realized it, the work of grooming absorbing him completely. When he finally stepped back, Ghost looked different. Still skeletal, still damaged, but dignified somehow. The clean coat caught the light, and for a moment, Tom could imagine what this horse had been years ago. Probably beautiful, probably proud, probably worth more than the man who'd owned him had ever appreciated. Tom left Ghost resting and drove into town, the list from his notepad clutched in his hand. Riverside woke slowly on weekday mornings, businesses opening one by one, shopkeepers sweeping sidewalks and unlocking doors. The feed store sat on the eastern edge of town, a squat metal building with a gravel lot and a faded sign that read Anderson Ranch Supply. Tom pulled in just as a young man was propping open the main door. The kid looked about 20, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt with the sleeves cut off. A ball cap advertising some seed company pulled low over his eyes. He glanced at Tom's truck, then at Tom himself, and recognition flickered across his face. Everyone in Riverside knew Tom Bennett or knew of him, the widower who'd shut himself away, the man whose tragedy had become local legend. The kid's expression shifted to something between pity and discomfort. Tom climbed out and approached, and the kid introduced himself as Danny, Rita's nephew, said his aunt had called ahead and told him Tom might be stopping by. The awkwardness faded as they moved into business, Tom explaining what he needed for an elderly, malnourished horse recovering from severe neglect. Danny listened, nodding, and led Tom through the store while pulling items from shelves with the confidence of someone who knew his inventory inside out. Senior feed, specially formulated for horses over 20 with easy-to-chew pellets and extra protein. Alfalfa hay, the best quality Danny had in stock, explaining that the calcium and nutrients would help rebuild Ghost's system. Electrolyte supplements to help with hydration. Probiotics to support gut health. Hoof ointment beyond what Frank had provided, the good stuff that actually worked. A better halter than the cracked leather Tom had found in his barn. Lead ropes. Even a new bucket because the one Tom had been using was probably harboring bacteria in its cracks. The total made Tom wince, but Danny immediately knocked 20% off, said it was the family discount and wouldn't hear arguments. Tom paid with a credit card that he hoped wouldn't be declined, relieved when the transaction went through, and loaded everything into his truck bed with Danny's help. Before he left, Danny mentioned that his aunt wanted Tom to stop by her place when he had time, said she'd been baking again and had more food than she knew what to do with. Tom drove back to the ranch thinking about Rita's kindness, about how she'd mobilized her family to help without making it feel like charity. The people of Riverside had given him space when he'd needed it, hadn't pushed when he'd withdrawn, but they'd been waiting for any sign that he was ready to rejoin the living. Asking for help with Ghost had apparently been that sign, and now the support was flowing back, quiet but steady. He unloaded the supplies and carried them into the barn, where Ghost watched his activity with what Tom was starting to recognize as curiosity. The horse's head tracked Tom's movements, ears forward, showing interest in the world beyond immediate survival for the first time. Tom mixed up a serving of the senior feed according to the instructions on the bag, creating a warm mash that smelled rich and sweet, far better than the oat mixture he'd been offering. Ghost ate more of this feed than he had of the oats, taking his time but consuming nearly 2 pounds over the course of an hour. Tom watched every bite, documenting it, looking for any signs of digestive distress. When Ghost finished and returned to resting, Tom spread fresh hay in the corner of the stall, the alfalfa green and fragrant, a stark contrast to the compressed, yellowed stuff Ghost had been lying on. The afternoon brought Dr. Morrison back, his daily check-in becoming routine. Frank examined Ghost thoroughly, checking the hoof wound which was already looking less angry, listening to the heart and lungs, palpating the swollen tendon. He pronounced himself cautiously optimistic, said Ghost was responding better than he'd expected, but cautioned Tom not to get too hopeful yet. Horses could turn fast, could seem stable one moment and crash the next. They needed to stay vigilant. Frank also brought news that he'd made some calls, trying to track down Ghost's ownership history. The horse had definitely belonged to Dale Crawford, a rancher who operated a large cattle operation about 30 miles north. Crawford had a reputation in the veterinary community, not a good one. Frank had treated animals from Crawford's ranch before, always underfed, always showing signs of rough handling. He'd filed complaints with the county, but nothing had ever come of them. Property rights and all that. As long as the animals weren't obviously dying, Crawford could treat them however he wanted. Tom felt the anger return, hotter this time. Ghost had been property to Crawford, nothing more. Used until broken, then discarded without a second thought. Frank warned that Crawford might come looking once word got around that Tom had taken in a white horse. Said Tom should be prepared for that conversation, Should probably consult with someone about the legal implications of keeping an animal that technically still belonged to someone else, even if that someone had abandoned it to die. But that was a problem for later. Right now, Tom needed to focus on keeping Ghost alive and improving. Frank left more medication, adjusted some dosages, showed Tom how to massage the swollen tendon to promote circulation and healing. He also mentioned that Ghost would need dental work eventually, that the worn teeth were probably causing significant pain and making eating harder than it should be. Add it to the list of expenses Tom couldn't afford but would find a way to cover anyway. The next several days fell into a rhythm that became Tom's entire world. Wake before dawn, check on Ghost first thing, provide water and feed, administer medications, change bandages, groom, clean the stall, monitor for any changes. Frank came daily, Rita appeared every other day with food Tom actually ate, and Danny from the feed store dropped off supplies Tom hadn't even ordered yet, things Danny thought might be helpful. Ghost improved incrementally. The fever broke completely on day 3. The hoof wound started closing on day 5. By day 7, Ghost was eating 3 pounds of feed per serving and had started showing interest in the hay Tom spread around the stall. Small changes, but changes nonetheless, and Tom clung to each one like proof that his effort mattered. On the 8th day, Ghost stood up. Tom had entered the barn at his usual time, expecting to find Ghost lying in his customary spot in the straw, but instead the horse was on his feet, swaying slightly but upright. Tom froze in the doorway, barely breathing, afraid any sudden movement might cause Ghost to collapse. But Ghost stayed standing, head low but eyes alert, and when Tom approached slowly, the horse took a single step forward to meet him. That step was wobbly, the legs shaking with effort, but it was deliberate, intentional. Ghost was choosing to move, was choosing to engage rather than simply endure. Tom reached out and rested his hand on Ghost's neck, feeling the warmth beneath the clean coat, feeling the pulse that beat stronger than it had 8 days ago. He found himself blinking back tears, overwhelmed by emotion he hadn't expected, overcome by the simple miracle of this horse standing when by all rights it should be dead. He led Ghost around the stall, supporting much of the weight, letting the horse practice using muscles that had atrophied from starvation and injury. They managed 3 full circuits before Ghost's legs began to tremble with exhaustion, and Tom guided him back to the straw. Ghost lay down with a grunt of relief, but this time the descent was controlled, not a collapse. The horse settled into the bedding and looked at Tom with both eyes now, the clouded one somehow seeing more than it should. Tom sat in the straw beside Ghost, not something he'd risked before but feeling safe to do now, and Ghost's head lowered until it rested against Tom's leg. They stayed that way for an hour, man and horse, both damaged, both healing, drawing strength from proximity and shared survival. Tom talked about Emma, about the plans they'd made for the ranch, about the horses they'd intended to raise. He confessed that he'd thought about giving up, about walking away from everything, but that Ghost had given him a reason to keep trying. And as he talked, Tom realized something that felt both profound and terribly simple. He'd been wrong about who was saving whom. He'd thought he was rescuing Ghost, thought he was the one providing salvation through care and attention and resources. But sitting there with Ghost's head heavy against his leg, feeling needed in a way he hadn't felt since Emma died, Tom understood that Ghost was rescuing him right back. The horse had given him purpose when purpose had evaporated, had given him a reason to get up, to plan ahead, to care about tomorrow, had broken through the shell of grief that had encased him and reminded him what it felt like to hope. The revelation didn't fix everything, didn't erase Emma's absence or heal the wound her death had carved into him, but it cracked open a space where light could enter, where the possibility of living instead of merely existing could take root. Tom sat there with Ghost in the quiet barn, morning light streaming through gaps in the walls, and felt something inside him shift toward acceptance. Emma was gone. That fact would never change. But he was still here, and maybe being here meant something after all. Days continued to pass, each one bringing small improvements. Ghost grew stronger, spending more time on his feet, eating more consistently, showing sparks of personality that had been buried under survival instinct. The horse was particular about his hay, preferring the alfalfa leaves to the stems. He liked being groomed, leaning into the brush when Tom worked on his shoulders and neck. He had a habit of resting his chin on the stall door when Tom was working nearby, as if wanting to be part of whatever was happening beyond his immediate space. Tom found himself talking to Ghost constantly, narrating his actions, sharing thoughts and memories, and even reading aloud from old books he found in the house. It didn't matter that Ghost couldn't respond. The act of speaking, of putting thoughts into words for an audience that couldn't judge or offer unwanted advice, became therapeutic in ways Tom hadn't anticipated. He could say anything to Ghost, confess anything, and the horse would simply listen with those clouded eyes full of understanding that transcended species. On the 15th day, Tom decided to try leading Ghost outside. The horse had been confined to the stall since arrival, and while the space was adequate, Tom knew Ghost needed sunlight and fresh air and the mental stimulation of new surroundings. Frank had cleared it, said gentle exercise would help with the healing, but cautioned Tom to take it slow and watch for any signs of distress. Tom haltered Ghost with the new equipment from Danny's store, pleased at how much better it fit than the old leather had. He opened the stall door and stepped into the barn aisle, giving the lead rope a gentle tug. Ghost hesitated at the threshold, head raising to look beyond the stall that had been his entire world for 2 weeks. For a moment, Tom thought the horse might refuse, might be too afraid of the unknown to risk it. Then Ghost took a step forward, then another, following Tom out of the stall and into the wider barn. They walked the length of the barn slowly, Ghost's steps careful but increasingly confident. Tom opened the main door, and sunlight flooded in, bright enough that both of them squinted against it. Ghost stopped at the threshold, nostrils flaring as he scented the outside air. Tom waited, patient, letting the horse make the decision. And then Ghost stepped forward into the sunlight, head raising, ears pricking forward, and Tom saw something he hadn't seen before. Joy. Simple, uncomplicated joy at feeling sun on hide and wind in mane and earth beneath hooves. They walked the perimeter of the barn, staying close to the structure in case Ghost needed support or decided he'd had enough. But the horse seemed to gain strength from being outside, steps becoming steadier, head staying high, eyes bright with interest in everything around him. Tom pointed out landmarks, narrating like a tour guide. The cottonwood grove where Emma used to read in the shade. The creek bed that flowed in spring. The pastures that had once held cattle and horses and life. Ghost listened, ears tracking Tom's voice, and Tom swore the horse understood the weight behind the words. The grief and loss and tentative hope all tangled together. When they'd completed the circuit and returned to the barn door, Tom was prepared to take Ghost back inside, but the horse resisted gently, pulling toward the open space beyond. Tom checked his watch. They'd been out 20 minutes, probably long enough for a first attempt. But Ghost's eyes were so bright, his stance so eager, that Tom gave in. 10 more minutes wouldn't hurt. They walked toward the front pasture, the one closest to the barn, where grass had grown wild and thick. Ghost's nose lowered to the green shoots, and after sniffing carefully, he took a bite. Then another. Fresh grass, the first Ghost had probably tasted in months or years. Tom watched the horse graze, watched him engage with the world as a living creature rather than a dying one, and felt satisfaction deeper than anything he'd experienced in years. A vehicle approached on the ranch road, dust rising behind it. Tom tensed, hand tightening on Ghost's lead rope, as the truck came into view. Black, newer model, expensive looking. Not anyone from town, nobody Tom recognized. The vehicle pulled up near the house and a man climbed out, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing jeans and a pressed button-down shirt, boots that had been shined recently. Everything about him radiated money and authority and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. Tom's gut clenched with recognition even before the man spoke. Dale Crawford. Had to be. The man who'd used Ghost up and thrown him away. Tom positioned himself slightly in front of the horse, protective instinct overwhelming any impulse toward civility. Crawford walked toward them with purposeful strides, his eyes fixed on Ghost. When he got within speaking distance, he stopped and crossed his arms, looking Ghost up and down with the assessing gaze of someone evaluating livestock at auction. His expression revealed nothing, But Tom caught the slight narrowing of his eyes, the tightening of his jaw. Crawford was surprised. He'd expected to find a dead horse or maybe no horse at all. Finding Ghost alive and improving clearly hadn't been in his calculations. Crawford introduced himself without preamble, his voice carrying the flat effect of someone used to being obeyed. Said he'd heard Tom had found a white gelding on the roadside, and that horse belonged to him. He had papers to prove it, had the bill of sale from when he'd purchased the animal 11 years ago. The horse had wandered off his property about 2 months back, and Crawford had assumed it was dead by now. But seeing as it was alive, he'd be taking it back. Today. Right now, actually, if Tom would be so kind as to hand over the lead rope. Tom didn't move, didn't hand over anything. Simply stood there between Crawford and Ghost, his hands steady on the rope, his eyes meeting Crawford's without flinching. He said Ghost wasn't going anywhere. Crawford's eyebrows rose slightly, the first real expression crossing his face. He explained, with exaggerated patience, that Tom didn't have a choice in the matter. Property law was clear. The horse belonged to Crawford regardless of where Tom had found it or how much effort he'd put into keeping it alive. Tom replied that abandonment nullified ownership, that leaving an animal to starve to death on the roadside was criminal neglect, and Crawford was lucky Tom hadn't already called the sheriff to press charges. Crawford's face hardened, the veneer of civility cracking. He said Tom didn't know what he was talking about, didn't know the first thing about running a ranch or managing livestock. The horse had been old, past usefulness, not worth the expense of keeping it. It had wandered off, and Crawford hadn't gone looking because why would he waste time on an animal that couldn't work anymore? The words confirmed everything Tom had suspected, but hearing them said aloud, hearing Crawford dismiss Ghost's suffering so casually, sent rage flooding through him. He took a step forward, his voice dropping to something low and dangerous. Told Crawford that Ghost had a name now, was more than property or livestock. Told him about the whip scars, the starvation, the infections and injuries that spoke to years of mistreatment. Told him that whatever paperwork Crawford had didn't matter because he'd forfeited his right to this horse the moment he'd driven away and left it dying in a ditch. Crawford's expression shifted to something colder, meaner. He warned Tom not to make this difficult, not to make accusations he couldn't prove. Said he'd be back with the sheriff, would get a court order if necessary, would take his property back one way or another. Tom could make it easy and hand over the horse now, or make it hard and end up in legal trouble he couldn't afford. Crawford's eyes flicked past Tom to Ghost, and Tom saw calculation there, saw the man doing math about whether the horse was worth the trouble. Then Crawford made his decision. He turned and walked back to his truck without another word, climbed in, and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust and the weight of threat hanging in the air. Tom watched him go, his heart pounding, adrenaline making his hands shake. Ghost pressed close against him, as if seeking protection, and Tom put his arm over the horse's neck, holding on as much for his own steadiness as for Ghost's. They stood there in the morning sun, man and horse, both understanding that something had shifted. The peaceful days of quiet recovery were over. Crawford would make good on his threat, would come back with authority and paperwork and force. And Tom would have to fight, not just for Ghost's life but for the principle that living beings deserved more consideration than property law typically granted them. Tom led Ghost back to the barn, his mind already racing through possibilities. He needed help, needed someone who understood the legal system, needed to build a case that abandonment and neglect had severed Crawford's claim. He settled Ghost in the stall with fresh hay and water, then pulled out his phone and called Frank Morrison. Explained what had happened, asked if Frank would be willing to document Ghost's condition when he'd first arrived, to provide testimony about the extent of the neglect and abuse. Frank agreed immediately, said he'd already been preparing records in case something like this happened. He'd document everything, would testify to Ghost's condition, would make it clear that Crawford's treatment amounted to criminal animal cruelty. But he warned Tom that Crawford had money and connections, had probably donated to the sheriff's campaigns, had the kind of influence that small ranchers like Tom couldn't match. This wouldn't be easy, and Tom needed to prepare for the possibility that he might lose. Tom thanked Frank and hung up, then made another call. To Rita, who answered on the second ring. He explained the situation, and Rita listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said she'd talk to people, would spread the word about what Crawford had done and what he was threatening to do now. Public opinion mattered in a town like Riverside, and if people knew the full story, they might be more willing to support Tom when things came to a head. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Tom photographed Ghost from every angle, documenting the remaining visible signs of neglect and abuse. He wrote down everything he could remember about finding Ghost, about the rescue, about the treatment and recovery. He gathered receipts from the feed store, Frank's bills for medical treatment, created a file of evidence that might matter if this went to court. And through it all, Ghost watched him with those clouded eyes, seeming to understand that something had changed, that the safety of the barn might not last. Tom kept returning to the stall, kept touching the horse, reassuring both of them that he wouldn't give up, wouldn't hand Ghost over, would fight this as hard as he needed to. Night fell, and Tom didn't leave the barn. He dragged his sleeping bag from the house and made a bed on the hay bales, positioning himself where he could see Ghost's stall. If Crawford came back, if anyone tried to take Ghost in the night, Tom would know. He'd be ready. He lay there in the darkness, listening to Ghost breathe, and made a promise to himself and to the horse and to Emma's memory. He wouldn't fail this time, wouldn't let something he cared about be taken away without fighting back. Whatever it cost, whatever it took, Ghost would stay safe. The horse had chosen to trust him, had fought to survive when survival seemed impossible, and Tom would honor that fight by fighting back just as hard. The barn was quiet except for the sound of Ghost shifting in the straw and the distant call of an owl hunting in the cottonwoods. Tom closed his eyes but didn't sleep, his mind too active, his body too tense. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new battles to wage. But tonight, Ghost was safe. Tonight, they both were. And sometimes, in the middle of a war, one peaceful night was enough to gather strength for what came next. The confrontation Tom had been dreading arrived 3 days later, though not in the form he'd expected. Sheriff Tom Bridger pulled up to the ranch in his official vehicle, the county seal painted on the door, lights off but presence unmistakable. Tom had been walking Ghost around the barn when he heard the engine, and his first instinct was to lead the horse inside, to hide him somehow, before logic reminded him that hiding was impossible and would only make things worse. Bridger climbed out slowly, adjusting his hat against the morning sun. He was in his late 50s, a Montana native who'd worn the badge for 23 years and had a reputation for fairness that generally matched reality. Tom had known him peripherally for years, had voted for him in the last 3 elections, had never had reason to interact with him professionally until Emma's accident. Bridger had been the one to come to the door that night, had delivered the news with a gentleness that Tom still remembered even through the haze of shock. The sheriff approached with his hands visible, a deliberate gesture of non-aggression. He greeted Tom by name, nodded acknowledgement toward Ghost, and asked if they could talk. Tom agreed, though his jaw was tight, his shoulders tense. They stood in the shade of the barn, Ghost grazing nearby on a long lead that gave him freedom to move while keeping him close. Bridger explained the situation with the careful neutrality of someone trying to navigate complicated waters. Dale Crawford had filed a complaint, had provided documentation of ownership, and was demanding the return of his property. The law was clear on this matter, Bridger said, his tone apologetic but firm. Ownership papers trumped possession, and unless Tom could prove Crawford had legally forfeited his rights, the horse would have to be returned. Tom listened, his anger building but controlled, and then began speaking with a precision he hadn't known he possessed. He described finding Ghost dying in that ravine, described the condition that spoke to months or years of neglect and abuse, described the medical treatment that had cost him over $2,000 so far, described the whip scars and the infections and the starvation that had brought Ghost within hours of death. He pulled out his phone and showed Bridger the photographs he'd taken, the documented evidence of suffering. Bridger looked at each image, his expression growing darker. He asked if Frank Morrison would testify to Ghost's condition, and Tom said Frank had already agreed to provide detailed records and expert testimony. Bridger nodded slowly, then admitted that Crawford had a history of complaints, though nothing had ever stuck. The rancher knew how to stay just on the legal side of animal cruelty laws, knew how to make problems disappear through influence and money. But this case might be different, Bridger said, his voice dropping lower. Because Tom had documentation, had witnesses, had a horse that was visibly thriving under his care compared to what Crawford had allowed. And because public opinion was already shifting. Rita Lawson had been busy, had apparently spent the last 3 days talking to everyone she knew, and the story of Ghost's rescue had spread through Riverside like wildfire. People were paying attention now, were asking questions about Crawford's other animals, were pressuring the county to investigate. Bridger couldn't ignore that pressure, couldn't be seen as siding with a wealthy rancher against a man who'd done the right thing. So here's what would happen. Crawford was entitled to a hearing, a formal proceeding where both sides could present their case and a magistrate could make a ruling. Until that hearing, Ghost would remain in Tom's custody, considered under protective care pending investigation. Crawford wouldn't like it, would probably raise hell, but it was the fairest compromise Bridger could offer. Tom felt relief wash through him, though he knew this was temporary. The hearing would be the real test, where Crawford's money and lawyers would face off against Tom's truth and Frank's testimony. Bridger warned him to be prepared, to document everything between now and then, to build the strongest case possible. Then the sheriff climbed back in his vehicle and drove away, leaving Tom alone with Ghost and the weight of a coming battle. The next 2 weeks became a blur of preparation. Frank Morrison compiled a comprehensive medical report detailing every injury, every sign of neglect, every indication that Ghost had been systematically mistreated for years. Danny at the feed store provided receipts and testimony about the specialized care Tom had needed to provide. Rita organized a petition among Riverside residents supporting Tom's custody of Ghost, gathering signatures from people who'd seen the horse's transformation or who simply believed Crawford needed to be held accountable. Tom himself spent hours each day with Ghost, not just caring for him but truly connecting with him. They walked the property together, Ghost growing stronger each day, his steps steadier, his body filling out as proper nutrition rebuilt what starvation had stolen. The white coat began to shine, the dull gray fading to something closer to its original color. The clouded eyes remained, the cataracts permanent, but Ghost navigated with increasing confidence, learning to trust Tom's guidance and his own remaining vision. And as Ghost healed physically, Tom found himself healing in ways he hadn't anticipated. The ranch no longer felt like a graveyard of failed dreams. He started small repairs, fixing things that had been broken for years, clearing brush, mending fences. Rita came by more often, sometimes with food, sometimes just to visit, and Tom found he didn't mind the company. They'd sit on the porch while Ghost grazed nearby, and Rita would talk about her late husband, about the loneliness of widowhood, about the slow process of learning to live again after loss. Tom listened more than he spoke, but occasionally he'd share something about Emma, about the baby they'd lost, about the years of numbness that had followed. Rita never offered platitudes or easy solutions, just understanding, and somehow that was enough. The isolation Tom had wrapped himself in began to crack, not shattering completely but developing fissures where light could enter. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in early October, held in the community center because the actual courthouse was being renovated. Tom woke before dawn that day, his stomach churning with anxiety. He dressed carefully in clothes he hadn't worn since Emma's funeral, dark jeans and a button-down shirt, boots polished for the first time in years. He checked on Ghost, who seemed to sense Tom's tension and pressed close against him, offering comfort in the simple way horses could. Rita arrived at 7 to drive Tom into town, explaining that it would look better if he wasn't showing up alone, that community support needed to be visible. They drove in silence, Rita's old station wagon rattling along the highway, and pulled into Riverside just as other vehicles were beginning to fill the community center parking lot. Tom was shocked by the number of people gathering. Seemed like half the town had shown up, farmers and shopkeepers and people Tom barely knew, all there to witness what would happen to the white horse that had become something more than just an animal in a custody dispute. Inside, the community center's main hall had been arranged to resemble a courtroom. Tables faced a raised platform where Magistrate Helen Briggs would preside, chairs set up in rows for observers. Crawford was already there with his attorney, a sharp-faced man in an expensive suit who looked profoundly out of place in rural Montana. Crawford himself sat calm and composed, radiating the confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight that mattered to him. Tom took his seat at the opposite table, Frank Morrison settling beside him. The veterinarian had agreed to speak on Tom's behalf, to provide the expert testimony that might make the difference. Rita sat in the front row directly behind Tom, and when he glanced back, he saw dozens of familiar faces filling the seats. Danny from the feed store, Linda from the diner, Pastor Grant from the church Tom hadn't attended since Emma died. Even old Mr. Hoffman, who had to be pushing 90, had made the trip into town to show support. Magistrate Briggs entered, and everyone rose. She was a woman in her 60s, gray hair pulled back severely, reading glasses perched on her nose, with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every trick and excuse the legal system could produce. She called the hearing to order, explained the parameters of the dispute, and invited Crawford's attorney to present his case first. The lawyer stood and launched into a presentation that was smooth and practiced. His client, Dale Crawford, was a respected rancher who'd purchased the horse in question 11 years prior, had documentation to prove ownership, and was simply seeking the return of property that had wandered from his land. Yes, the horse had been old and in declining health, but that was the natural consequence of age. Crawford had not abandoned the animal. It had left his property of its own accord, and he'd had no way of knowing where it had gone. The attorney painted Tom as well-meaning but misguided, someone who'd taken possession of property that wasn't his and was now refusing to return it despite clear legal ownership. He suggested that Tom's emotional attachment, while understandable, didn't override property rights. He presented Crawford's bill of sale, registration papers, and argued that the law was unambiguous. The horse belonged to Crawford, and sentiment couldn't change that fact. When the attorney finished and sat down, looking satisfied, Magistrate Briggs turned to Tom. She asked if he had representation, and Tom stood, explaining that he couldn't afford a lawyer but would speak for himself. Briggs nodded, her expression unreadable, and invited him to present his side. Tom's hands shook as he stood, but his voice came out steady. He didn't try to be eloquent or legal. He simply told the truth. Described driving down Highway 312 on that August evening, seeing what he'd thought was debris in the ravine, stopping when he realized it was a living creature. He described Ghost's condition in detail, not sparing anything, making the observers understand the extent of the suffering Crawford's neglect had caused. He explained the rescue, the medical treatment, the cost in money and time and emotional energy he'd invested, not because he expected anything in return, but because leaving a dying animal to suffer alone wasn't something he could do. He talked about the whip scars, about injuries that predated Ghost's time in the ravine, about a pattern of abuse that went back years. And he stated plainly that Crawford had abandoned Ghost, had made a conscious decision not to search for a missing animal, had assumed it would die and had been content with that outcome. Tom's voice grew stronger as he spoke, anger fueling his words but not overwhelming them. He challenged Crawford's claim of ownership, arguing that property rights came with responsibilities, and Crawford had abdicated those responsibilities completely. Ghost wasn't property anymore, wasn't livestock to be used and discarded. Ghost was a living being who deserved protection from the person who'd harmed him. When Tom finished and sat down, the hall was silent. Magistrate Briggs made notes on her pad, then called Frank Morrison to testify. The veterinarian approached the front, was sworn in, and began presenting his medical findings. He had brought photographs, x-rays, detailed records that painted a damning picture of long-term neglect and abuse. He testified that Ghost's condition when Tom had brought him in was consistent with months of inadequate nutrition, that the injuries and infections indicated minimal to no veterinary care, that the whip scars represented sustained physical abuse. Frank's testimony was clinical and professional, but his anger showed through in the tightness of his jaw, the clipped precision of his words. He stated his professional opinion that Crawford's treatment of Ghost constituted criminal animal cruelty, that abandonment was not only evident but could be proven, and that returning Ghost to Crawford's custody would be unconscionable and likely fatal for the animal. Crawford's attorney tried to poke holes in Frank's testimony during cross-examination, suggesting the veterinarian was biased, that his friendship with Tom colored his professional judgment. Frank shut that down coldly, stating that his oath as a veterinarian required him to advocate for animal welfare regardless of personal relationships, and that his findings would be the same whether Tom was involved or not. Next came testimony from Rita, who described the transformation she'd witnessed, the difference between the dying horse Tom had brought home and the thriving animal ghost had become. She spoke about Tom's dedication, about the nights he'd slept in the barn to monitor Ghost's condition, about the financial burden he'd taken on without complaint. She also mentioned the petition she'd circulated, presenting Magistrate Briggs with pages of signatures from Riverside residents who supported Tom's custody. Danny testified about the specialized supplies Tom had purchased, about the level of care required to rehabilitate a severely neglected horse. Even Pastor Grant spoke, framing the issue in terms of moral responsibility and the obligation to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. One by one, members of the community stood and added their voices to Tom's defense, building a wall of support that Crawford's attorney couldn't breach. Finally, Magistrate Briggs called Crawford himself to testify. The rancher approached with the same confidence he'd shown throughout, was sworn in, and answered his attorney's softball questions with rehearsed responses. Yes, he'd owned the horse. No, he hadn't mistreated it. Yes, it had wandered off, but that wasn't abandonment, just an unfortunate occurrence. He painted himself as a reasonable businessman dealing with an unreasonable situation. But when Frank Morrison was given the opportunity to question Crawford, the facade began to crack. Frank asked specific questions about Ghost's care, about veterinary visits, about nutrition and shelter. Crawford's answers grew vague, contradictory. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had a vet examine the horse, couldn't say what he'd been feeding it, couldn't explain the whip scars except to suggest they'd been there when he'd purchased the animal 11 years ago. Frank produced Crawford's purchase records and pointed out that the bill of sale described a healthy 6-year-old gelding with no scars or injuries. So where had the scars come from? Crawford shifted in his seat, said horses got injured on ranches, it was normal. Frank asked if Crawford considered whip marks normal injuries. Crawford's attorney objected, but Magistrate Briggs overruled him, stating she wanted to hear the answer. Crawford's composure finally broke. He snapped that Frank didn't understand ranch operations, didn't understand that animals were tools not pets, and sometimes tools needed discipline. The words hung in the air, damning, revealing more than any testimony could have. Crawford seemed to realize his mistake immediately, but it was too late. He'd confirmed everything Tom and Frank had been arguing, had demonstrated exactly the mindset that had led to Ghost's suffering. Magistrate Briggs called a recess, stating she needed time to review the evidence and testimony. The hall erupted into conversation as people stood and stretched, but Tom sat frozen, unable to read Briggs' expression, unable to predict which way she'd rule. Rita squeezed his shoulder. Frank offered a tight smile, but Tom felt nothing but numbness. He'd done everything he could. The rest was out of his hands. The recess lasted 45 minutes that felt like hours. When Briggs returned and called the hearing back to order, the hall fell silent so completely that Tom could hear his own heartbeat. The magistrate looked over her notes, then removed her reading glasses and looked directly at Crawford before turning to Tom. She began by stating that property law was indeed clear, that ownership papers carried significant legal weight. But she continued, Montana law also recognized that ownership came with duties, and abandonment could constitute forfeiture of property rights. The question before her was whether Crawford had abandoned Ghost, and the evidence overwhelmingly suggested he had. Briggs detailed her reasoning. Crawford had made no effort to locate the horse after it disappeared from his property. He'd assumed it was dead and had been content with that assumption. He'd provided minimal care prior to the disappearance, as evidenced by Ghost's condition and Crawford's own inability to document appropriate veterinary attention or nutrition. The whip scars indicated abuse, and Crawford's testimony had confirmed he viewed horses as tools requiring discipline rather than living beings deserving humane treatment. In contrast, Briggs continued, Tom Bennett had demonstrated extraordinary care and commitment. He'd rescued Ghost at significant personal cost, had provided extensive medical treatment, had invested time and resources into rehabilitation. The community support demonstrated public recognition of Tom's efforts and widespread belief that Ghost's welfare was best served in his custody. Magistrate Briggs leaned forward, her voice carrying authority that silenced any thought of interruption. She ruled that Dale Crawford had abandoned Ghost through neglect and indifference, that this abandonment constituted forfeiture of ownership rights, and that custody of the horse would be transferred permanently to Tom Bennett. She further ruled that Crawford was prohibited from acquiring horses for a period of 5 years and would be subject to investigation by county animal welfare authorities regarding his treatment of other animals on his property. The hall erupted. People stood, applauding, shouting approval. Tom sat stunned, unable to process what he'd just heard. Rita was hugging him. Frank was shaking his hand. And around him the community celebrated a victory that felt larger than one horse's custody. It felt like justice, like the world occasionally tilting toward fairness, like the right thing actually prevailing for once. Crawford and his attorney left quickly, the rancher's face dark with fury but impotent now. His influence hadn't been enough. His money hadn't swayed the outcome. The truth had been stronger, and he'd lost. Tom watched him go and felt no satisfaction, just relief. Ghost was safe. That was all that mattered. The crowd filtered out slowly, people stopping to congratulate Tom, to tell him they'd known he'd win, to offer continued support. Tom accepted their words with quiet gratitude, still somewhat in shock, not quite believing it was over. When the hall finally emptied and only Rita and Frank remained, Tom excused himself and walked outside. He needed air, needed space, needed to absorb what had just happened. He stood in the parking lot, looking at the October sky, feeling the cool breeze that spoke of coming winter. And then he pulled out his phone and scrolled to a photo of Emma, the same one he'd carried as his background for 3 years. He looked at her smile and whispered that he'd done it, that he'd saved something worth saving, that he'd fought and won, and maybe that meant something. Rita drove Tom back to the ranch, chattering happily about the hearing, about the looks on Crawford's face when Briggs ruled against him, about how the whole town would be talking about this for months. Tom listened with half his attention, the other half already reaching ahead to the moment when he could tell Ghost that it was over, that no one could take him away now, that they were both safe. When they pulled up to the house, Tom thanked Rita for everything, promised to come by the bakery tomorrow, and practically ran to the barn. He found Ghost in his stall, head raised expectantly as if he'd been waiting. Tom opened the door and went to the horse, wrapping his arms around the strong neck, pressing his face against the white coat that smelled of hay and horse and safety. He told Ghost it was over, told him about the hearing, about Briggs' ruling, about the fact that Ghost was his now, legally and permanently. The horse couldn't understand the words, but seemed to comprehend the emotion behind them. Ghost pressed close, sharing warmth and presence, offering the same comfort Tom had provided during those first desperate days. They stood that way for a long time, man and horse, both survivors of traumas that had tried to break them. Neither perfect, neither completely healed, but both alive and moving forward together. Tom eventually stepped back, wiped his eyes, and led Ghost outside. The afternoon sun painted the ranch in golden light, the kind of light Emma had loved, and Tom walked with Ghost through the pastures that were slowly coming back to life under his renewed attention. He thought about the future for the first time in years. About rebuilding the ranch, about maybe taking in other neglected animals, about creating something meaningful from the ashes of his grief. Ghost couldn't replace Emma or their lost child, couldn't erase 3 years of pain, but the horse had given Tom something equally valuable. A reason to keep going, proof that broken things could heal, evidence that choosing compassion over convenience could change lives. As they walked, Ghost's strength was obvious. The skeletal frame had filled out with muscle and healthy weight. The coat gleamed white in the sun, scars still visible but no longer defining the horse's appearance. Ghost moved with confidence now, head high, ears forward, interested in the world rather than just enduring it. The transformation was complete, or as complete as it would ever be. Some damage was permanent, but damage didn't mean destroyed. Tom led Ghost to the creek that ran through the back property, the water running clear after recent rains. Ghost drank deeply, then lifted his head to survey the landscape, and Tom saw himself reflected in that stance. Both of them looking forward instead of back. Both of them changed by what they'd survived. Both of them proof that tomorrow could be different from yesterday if you were willing to try. The sun began its descent toward the mountains, and Tom guided Ghost back to the barn. He provided evening feed, fresh water, spread clean bedding. He stood at the stall door for a moment, watching Ghost settle in, and felt peace wash over him. This was enough. This simple routine of caring for another living being, this quiet satisfaction of needs met and comfort provided, this was enough to build a life on. He left the barn and walked toward the house, pausing on the porch to look back. The barn stood solid in the fading light, and Tom could just see Ghost's white shape through the open stall window. He'd saved that horse, but the truth ran deeper. They'd saved each other, had pulled each other back from edges neither had expected to survive. Tom went inside, made dinner for the first time in recent memory instead of eating whatever Rita had brought, and sat at the kitchen table that had been empty for too long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to fail or succeed. But tonight, Tom Bennett was alive in a way he hadn't been for 3 years. His heart beat with purpose. His hands had meaningful work. His future held possibilities instead of just empty repetition. And in the barn, Ghost slept peacefully for the first time since he could remember, secure in the knowledge that he was wanted, that he was safe, that he'd found someone who saw value in what others had discarded. Two souls, broken and mended, building something beautiful from the wreckage of their pasts. The Montana night settled over the ranch, stars emerging in the vast sky, and all was quiet, all was well. And in that quietness, in that wellness, healing continued in ways both would carry forward for whatever time remained to them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.